What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so continuing on with Messiah Complex, this basically wraps up like the first phase, or at least the conclusion of Messiah Complex, wraps up the first post-House of M phase of Marvel Comics. People usually say it's decimation. I mean, I kind of guess I would consider it to be the same thing, but this is where Marvel kind of breaks things off. And for Messiah Complex, you basically jump into X-Men Divided We Stand, which is actually pretty cool. It's a really cool concept. But you get stuff like a new X-Force line of comics, Uncanny X-Men continues on, X-Factor continues on, and then you get like the Cable solo series. You get like a handful of things that come out of this, and they all kind of run and tell like an intertwining story for the most part. So picking up with the idea that like Bishop had basically shot Forge and taken out Cable for the purpose of securing this baby. Again, we didn't initially know why. I mean, we didn't really know why like Bishop was so hardcore after this kid. Instead, immediately after this happens, we're met with the arrival of Gambit and the Marauders. Now, somebody that I want to point your attention to here for a second is a character by the name of Vertigo. Now, Vertigo is a really interesting concept in Marvel because she's old. She's really like old school, but she is one of these characters where she's what's called a human mutate. And a human mutate is different from mutants. Mutants have their genes activated, basically. You know, they go through puberty, they go through like some kind of stressful event in their lives, whether they're a teenager, they're an adult, whatever the case is, and the X gene activates. When it comes to the character of Vertigo, she's actually from the Savage Land. She's basically kind of an experiment of sorts. But the idea is that she's essentially has like powers, and her ability is to manipulate the nervous system, more or less, of anyone that she comes into contact with, so long as they're not strong enough to overcome her abilities. Vertigo just kind of distorts your perception of reality. And so, of course, Bishop's able to hold his own against pretty much the entirety of the Marauders, or at least to a degree, because of course it's Bishop. And that's one thing to bear in mind here. You're talking about a guy who can essentially absorb energy, like any kind of energy, and then channel it back at people. And so when it comes to like Gambit's, you know, explosive abilities and so on and so forth, if Bishop can absorb it, he can channel it back at them. And that's why he's so dangerous. Now remember, when it comes to Bishop, there's also an upper cap. He's like a cup of water. You have to empty out whatever's in that cup as you fill it up, otherwise it's going to overflow. And the equivalent of overflowing for Bishop is that he literally blows up. And so the result is that he's not really, you know, he doesn't really blow up or anything like that, but he is incapacitated by the Marauders, who basically take the baby and bail. And so from here, we essentially pick up with like the actual X-Men arriving on the scene. Of course, in the last video, we talked about how they were simply traveling to Forge, since that's the last place that Jamie Madrox and Layla Miller had basically been sent to. Now, of course, with Bishop basically kind of cooking the books and saying, hey, look, I came here to try to figure out what was going on, and you know, they took out Cable, and Cable's gone now, and the Marauders took the baby, and I have no idea what happened. The X-Men sort of go along with it, because what reason do they have to ask any different? Now, this also brings in the nature of telepaths, and this is kind of an important thing. Right off the bat, one of the things that people will ask is, well, if Emma Frost is one of the most powerful telepaths in Marvel Comics, and Bishop's lying, why doesn't she just tell everybody Bishop's lying? Because she doesn't have a reason to read his mind. There's no reason to suspect wrongdoing, and that's why it's the perfect cover. And so from here, we pick up with Cable, and this is kind of cool, because what Cable initially does is once he locates his ship, he basically sends out kind of like a telepathic SOS to Charles Xavier and basically says, you're the only person that can help me save the entirety of humanity and mutant kind. And so of course this leads to Charles Xavier basically responding to Cable and showing up and saying, okay, you know, let's get to work and let's see what's going on. Now, before that, what we actually end up doing is jumping over to a character named Siren who meets with Jamie Madrox. And this is kind of an important thing because Siren is, and I can never remember if she's the daughter of Banshee or like the niece of Banshee. I want to say she's the daughter of Banshee. Whatever it is, she inherited her father's voice. So she's got the sonic scream and the ability to let herself fly. She was never really important. That's one of the things though, when it comes to Messiah Complex and really like a lot of the stories that we're going to see going forward, it's going to be kind of like this huge veritable who's who of the X-Men community. Virtually every single obscure character all the way up to the most popular characters are going to appear at some point along the line in these various stories. So you literally get a huge tour. But in response to this, what we end up learning is that when you had Jamie Madrox and you had Layla Miller, who had essentially been sent into like two distinctly different universes, what they ended up doing was arriving in the future where Bishop was a kid. And that's where we basically got a future that was almost identical to Days of Future Past. Now, Layla Miller destroyed that version of Jamie Madrox that had gone along with her, at least that version, that one of his multiples who was there. And when it died, it basically sent all that knowledge back to Jamie himself. And that's when he says, we have to find Bishop, because Bishop is a person who's basically on the warpath trying to keep this future from happening. And that's why all this is taking place. Now, of course, this basically leads to the X-Men kind of bringing in formation, but it even picks up with Xavier talking directly to Cable. And Xavier's whole stance here when the Sentinels were attacking the X-Mansion was that Cable was the one that sent them there. Now, of course, Cable's response is, I have no clue what you guys are talking about. I'm here on a mission of mercy, more or less, to save the future. You got to help me out here. And so, of course, that's when Xavier kind of jumps in and says, okay, we'll go ahead and make that happen. And so what we end up doing is jumping to Muir Island itself. Now, for those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, Muir Island is a concept that you don't really see anymore. And the reason for this is because it's part and parcel to an age of comics that don't really exist anymore. Marvel has, for the most part, kind of abandoned the idea of creating a more cohesive line of X-Men stories. I mean, you have like X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue and X-Men Red, but they're pretty much divided. Like, they're basically separate. But the whole idea with this is that Muir Island is an island that goes way back, way back. Really as far back as like Claremont and even maybe a little bit before then. But that was the home of Moira McTaggart. And Moira McTaggart was kind of like this mutant geneticist. And the X-Men universe, as it existed back then, when you had Claremont writing the show, or really writing the whole line of stories, is you had Charles Xavier and the X-Men over at the Institute, and then you had Moira, who would come across various mutants and then would basically study their genes. Not in a way that she would experiment on them, but she would help them to learn how their abilities worked. That's where you got characters like Rain Sinclair, Wolfsbane, different things like that. The work of Moira McTaggart went, kind of hand in hand with Xavier and actually led to the formation of the New Mutants. So there were a lot of things that happened with regards to like them working together and really the history of Muir Island itself. But what we end up doing is finding out, of course, the Marauders basically being here to serve Mr. Sinister, that when Sinister gets the baby and essentially kind of turns around to go, or at least Gambit follows him, we end up finding out that Sinister is not Sinister. Instead, Sinister is actually Mystique, and it's been that way for quite some time. And the whole reason behind this is because of the fact that Mystique is trying to find a way to bring back Rogue. Now, the whole idea of the Hecatomb goes back to 2007 with Condition Critical Parts 1 and 2 in X-Men Volume 2, 197 and 198, I think it was. The whole thing with this is that Cable, when he traveled from the future to the past, initially, he didn't come on his own. He basically came with a sentient ship called Greymalkin. And the whole idea behind it was that Cable established Providence as an island that was really more of like a mutant refuge than anything else. But the Hecatomb was created by the Shi'ar Empire. And initially, it was just like this device that could absorb minds. The problem with it was that over time, it began to become sentient and actually like absorbed every single mind that it came across. And so eventually it basically landed in Providence. It started absorbing people. Rogue touched it to stop it. And the result was that she basically absorbed 8 billion minds at once, and it drove her insane and put her in a coma. And so the whole idea behind Mystique's actions here is that as the mother of Rogue, it was to go by any means necessary to rescue her daughter and to bring her back. The problem with this is that when it comes to the whole idea of Mystique sort of trying to bring back Rogue, it really is like potentially dooming the entirety of the planet to save her daughter. But it also kind of makes sense too. I mean, like, what lengths would a mom not go to save her child? And that's really the whole idea behind this. Now, this was done, or at least the idea of Mystique doing what she did, was really predicated on the notion of what was called Destiny's Diaries. Now, Destiny is a character that goes all the way back to like Uncanny X-Men 141 or something like that. But Irene Adler was basically a mutant that had the ability to see the future. And all these different things that she saw, if they weren't necessarily stories about like, well, you have to stop this from happening, because things are going to go awry. What this meant is she would basically record them in diaries. And in the early days of Chris Claremont's run, or at least in the early days of the creation of Irene Adler and, his Destiny, what you ended up having is you would basically have this idea that Destiny's Diaries were kind of like a caveat. It was a way to create a story or stop a set of events from happening. Like somebody would come along and say, oh man, Destiny's Diaries foretold this would happen. We have to stop it from taking place. And it worked because back then, Chris Claremont didn't really rely on them as like a plot device all the time. With this whole thing, what happened is because Mystique and Destiny were so close, the Diaries of Destiny were really more of Mystique just kind of holding on to a trinket, something from a long lost lover. But use that information, it basically foretold everything that was going to happen with regards to like Providence and the Hecatomb and all that kind of stuff, and the steps that Mystique would need in order to essentially save Rogue. Hence the entire reason why they've been hunting for this baby is to grab it, to bring it in and see if this new mutant basically has the power to absorb all these minds from Rogue. It was really a gamble, and there was no guarantee it would happen. Now, while all that's going on, you essentially have like this massive fight that's taking place between like a lot of people. I mean, you got X-Force, you got the Marauders, you've got Cable who's arrived on the scene, you've got X-Men. You have like this huge massive battle that takes place out there. But the way the story's told is basically kind of a background thing. It's really more of a thing that's just there, but it's not like the main focus. Instead, the main focus here is really put on like Mystique trying to resurrect Rogue. Initially, like Gambit freaks out, right? Like this happens and Gambit panics. He's like, why in the world would you sacrifice a child like that with no guarantee that it would actually work? And so what ends up happening is Mystique just kind of seems to give up when Rogue simply doesn't come up. And then you basically have, you have Professor X, who's given the baby by Gambit, and then at that point hands it over to Cable and essentially says, jump into the future. Like, if what you say is true, if what you say is that this baby will basically, essentially has the ability to save the entirety of the human and mutant race, then like grab the baby, jump into the future, and do what you have to do in order to keep it safe. That's the kind of important thing here, because at this point, it's really more of like a cat and mouse game, and that's what this turns into, as it'll eventually turn into a cat and mouse game between Bishop and Cable. And it initially starts off right here when Bishop shows up and sees that basically Cable's being given the baby by Xavier, and then Bishop starts to freak out. At the same time this happens, of course, Rogue wakes up. Now again, this is one of those things that we refer to as a soft reboot for all the new folks here. And the idea that you basically end up having this concept where a character is kind of reworked and restructured by virtue of a set of events. And Rogue's powers are going to be reworked and restructured as a result of the actions of this baby curing her of the hecatomb, of strain 88. And so from here, you kind of pick up with a couple of different people. Like, you pick up with a battle between Exodus and Emma Frost. I'm actually kind of on the fence about this. It's one of those weird things where like writers just kind of change characters based on the story they want to tell at any particular point in time. It's just kind of the nature of comics. Nothing's an absolute, but still, I mean, it is kind of cool here because, I mean, you've got the various X-Men, X-Force, various groups facing off against, these different characters who are out there. But the funny thing is that Cyclops initially takes the baby from Cable. And the idea is that Cyclops wants to keep it and raise it. But then suddenly the whole thing is brought back with like his memories of Jean Grey and like Madeline Pryor and like giving up Nathan. And that's the whole idea is in his mind, he gave up Nathan to take him to the future so Nathan could be saved. And there was no guarantee he was ever going to see the baby. In fact, back in the old comics, and kind of what's reiterated here is that like he's never going to see that baby again. It was the same thing with like Jean Grey dying. Cyclops's entire life is mired with loss. But this really marks the first time when he will willingly give something up for the greater good. Not because, not because it's to save someone's life, not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's literally for the greater good of humans, really of humans and mutants. And so the result is that he hands a kid over and simply says, keep her safe. Do not let this kid die. And so where you end up having Cable, who basically body slides into the future, Bishop fires off a couple shots and kills Charles Xavier. Now, the funny thing about this is that the way that Charles Xavier's death is depicted here is almost indicative of like the reception to Charles Xavier dying. In Marvel Comics, Professor X has died quite a few times. And the whole thing here is that he's dead. He's shot in the head. It's 2 panels long. He's shot in the head. And Wolverine's like, yeah, man, it's a clean headshot. There's really nothing we can do. And they're like, well, what do we do, Cyclops? And he's like, we pray. And done. That's it. And they're just kind of like, that's the way it goes. I mean, that's kind of how Professor X's deaths are viewed now. And that's kind of the problem with death in comics. There was a time when death in comics was a permanent thing and killing someone was significant. But then Superman died and then Superman came back. And then a bunch of writers after that were just like, well, I mean, it's just a really easy way to tell a story, so we'll just kill him, whatever, like who cares, it doesn't really matter, we can bring him back anytime we want to. And that's kind of the direction that you go in with comics in the modern day. But again, it's kind of a crazy thing because with Professor X being gone, it's just kind of the X-Men left to sort of put themselves in a direction to where they can start working on their own. But that's the important thing here is, unlike a lot of other writers that you will see, Ed Brubaker, in terms of what he did here, was not for the purpose of like dramatic effect. It was designed for the purpose of moving the X-Men in a new direction where someone besides Professor X leads the X-Men's team. And so from here, you essentially jump into a whole new line of things. You get Uncanny X-Men that continues on after this. You get a new X-Force story. You get X Factor, which doesn't really matter. You get a Cable solo series, which actually covers what he's doing when he's taking Hope and jumping around into the future, which is actually like probably the most significant part of the post-Messiah complex landscape. And then you get X-Men Legacy, which I believe is a renamed X-Men Volume 2. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.